Well, I tested my speeds, tested them multiple times, and they're okay. If they're slightly on the fast side, they're not far on the fast side, and the higher speeds are certainly not fast. But they're all within reasonable tolerance. And so I'll doing nothing to those. I'll just clean my lenses. Put them into place. So there's my shutter, all looking pretty good. Of course we need a nameplate on the front of it. I knew there was something missing. Where have I put that? This will make it look better. There we go, that's a bit better. That's ready to go back on the camera. But of course I haven't finished cleaning the camera body up yet. Well, I did get the rewind knob off. It did unscrew without too much of a fight. I gave it a bit of solvent first. So I'll clean up these components in the ultrasonic cleaner. I think they're pretty filthy. The bellows struts, they really need the same treatment. They're pretty grubby, and I want them clean before I start trying to straighten them up to put them together. So I'll get those into the ultrasonic cleaner. But parts I need to manually clean will be our focus mount here, and I'll do that manually because it's got felt on the back. I don't want to have to play with that. Our focus scale ring needs cleaned, and I can't put that through the ultrasonic cleaner because it would strip the paint out of the markings. And of course the camera body itself, which is filled with grit and dirt, and at the top there's all this green grease to deal with. So I'll get the parts that can be put through the cleaner. I'm doing that now. I'll come back and manually clean the others. Right, start with the cleaning. As sticky as this camera has been with its problems with the dried out green grease gumming up everything in sight, and the fight I had trying to get the lens off the front of the shutter, it has to be said that the camera is generally in quite good order. Probably hasn't seen a lot of work. I was going to put the rewind knob through the cleaner, but that's not appropriate because of the black paint there. That would just go away. That grease is pretty tenacious stuff. It doesn't wipe away easily. And here, the lens mount, or the focus mount. Fortunately, this is not the same grease. And dried out though it may be, it's not green. It hasn't set hard. Or as hard, I should probably say. Certainly dried out. So how did the Kodak camera come to have nasty green grease that is thought of as a characteristic of Agfa cameras? Well, I can only assume that it was tried by Kodak as an experiment to see whether it suited them or not, or possibly as a short-term expedient because their normal supplier had no stock available, and so that they bought something else to use in the interim. It's certainly unusual to find green grease in a Kodak camera, so it was a short-lived aberration, you might say, either as an experiment or as an expedient because they could get nothing else. Those parts are clean. What about this body? This is pretty nasty. It's a problem when you've got sand and grease together. It doesn't move nicely with your degreaser, and you can't just brush the sand away because it's glued in place with the grease. So I'm looking at the state here of the bellows, making sure that there's no sign that they are coming adrift from the body casting. Any hint of that, I've got to strip them and re-glue them. But you don't do it lightly because there's always a danger that you actually damage the bellows and ruin them completely, removing them from the body. You only do it in great need. Now I've got rid of all that grease, so I can just use a paintbrush to shift some of that grit that's stuck in the body. And that cavity looks good now. At the top of the camera, yeah, green grease, good fun. Here I'm using something a bit more energetic, CRC Heavy Duty Lectraclean, which is better at getting rid of stuff like this than Naphtha. Naphtha is quite a mild solvent as petroleum products go. This stuff has trichloroethylene. Trichloroethylene seems to be its main active component. Managed to stab myself in the finger with that spring. And in the back of the camera. Right. And here where the take-up spool sits, get all that old dried grease off there. There shouldn't be much grease in here apart from that. That, I think, is sufficiently well cleaned. And I've just heard the ultrasonic cleaner finish, so hopefully the struts are good. Well, the struts are back from the cleaner and I can have a look at them, see what state they're in. That inner strut there is certainly bent. Let's just square that up a bit. You can generally straighten these things up with your fingers. You're not requiring a great deal of use of tools, except where using a tool allows you to apply the force over a very small area that you might not be able to achieve with your fingers. But that's looking pretty good. They seem quite snug, they appear to be quite good. So I think they can go back into the body. And what else did I have here? I had my rewind that I put through the cleaner. That's much happier now. That was covered in very sticky grease. I think I'm ready to do some reassembly. And all of my fasteners and so forth have been through the ultrasonic cleaner. So it should be a fairly straightforward job to put everything back together. But then I've said that before. Let's find out. So I'll apply some synthetic grease to the guide slots at the back of the struts. I don't usually put it into the front of the struts at this stage because I only end up wiping it off with my fingers while I'm working, and get these struts into position. We've got 4 screws, one at the top, one at the bottom, 2 in the film cassette well. I want the 2 prettiest screws in the film cassette well. The other 2 second best can go up here. Or second worst, I should think. The ugliest one always goes at the bottom because that'll be under the leatherettes, and usually it's the screw that's most damaged because that's where the fight is to get the thing loose. And in the film cassette well here, the 2 prettiest screws go in there because in theory they have suffered the least in the struggle of taking things to pieces. Now, if I recall correctly, none of these screws was much of a struggle to get loose when I took the camera apart. As frequently they are. Right, I'll do up these 2 screws in the film cassette well. One on the camera top, one on the camera bottom. Pop the struts out. They pop out into position, seem nice and rigid, wasn't overly hard to get that to happen. Now assembling the focus mount. Here's our focus mount. This notch designates the top. Here is the inner and outer helical. And I have in mind that I failed to mark the position of the inner and outer helical. So this could be a bit of a challenge. I've got my 2 alignment marks for the bottom here and 1 alignment mark for the top, so I know where the outer helical was relative to my focus scale ring. It doesn't tell me much about the position of the inner and outer helical together because I failed to mark them. So let's try this. That's going to be somewhere there. What's that look like? Oh, that doesn't look 100 miles away. I think for the sake of the argument we'll pretend that the inner and outer are correct at that point. So that needs to be lubricated with a bit of helical grease. And if I've got that position incorrect, well, that's something I'll have to correct while I'm working on it. It's okay. Worst things happen at sea. So I'll apply some grease at usually 5 or 6 spots around the perimeter. You don't need to completely clog the threads with grease. That's counterproductive, it'll just make it very stiff. That seems to run smoothly. Put a couple of spots in the guide slots here. Where's the mount? That's the top here. Let's check the action. Seems pretty good. I'll run some around the outside here where it runs in the mount. Back where we were. Seems pretty good. I'll try that in the back on the camera body. Let's have a quick look at that. 4 screws locate that mount together here. Let's just get 2 of them in and see what it looks like. And this round at its infinity stop, how does that look? That could be correct. I'm willing to be convinced. That certainly looks credible to me. If it had a mark on it at that point, I certainly wouldn't have questioned it. I would have accepted that as being exactly as it should have been. So I'll assemble it there and check the camera focus once I've got the shutter back on the camera and see if I was right. So 4 screws, 1 at each corner. And someone needs some fly there, needs to be given a droplet infection. 4 screws pass through here to hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. I'll get them on there. Once they're all in position, I can tighten them up. Pull the struts out and get that focus scale ring on here. Line it up with my alignment marks, top and bottom. And put the 4 screws in place. One more and we'll be winning. Don't over tighten those screws, all you'll achieve is that you'll distort the outer helical and make it stiff to move. Right, at this stage I'm going to check my focus because there's nothing else I really need on the camera in order to achieve that. So I'll put the lens and shutter assembly on here and see what I get. Get that retaining ring started. That seems okay. That'll do. I've got the shutter open on T, aperture fully open. I'll check what I get on the focus screen. Well, that certainly was correct. That was the correct position to have it. So I really need to tighten up my shutter retaining ring there now in the body, which is always awkward. Got to get the shutter aligned, of course, correctly. I'm aligning my infinity mark up against the register there, and if I can get it tight at that spot, I'm in business. If it's loose, what happens is when you set it to a 500th of a second, you've got to require a lot more force to set the shutter, and that can actually rotate the shutter in the body. So it's important that it is up snug. Of course, if you overdo it, you'll end up breaking something. That's just life, isn't it? Right, that part's done. I think we put the front door on the camera body next. What state's this in? A bit dusty. Get rid of that dust. Bit of corrosion underneath the foot there. I'll get that off, or at least I'll get some of it off. Corrosion doesn't wipe away, but some of the corrosion products might. Just wipe these struts here. They're quite clean. There's paint loss here. Now that's rust under there. The only way you could effectively deal with that would be to strip the leather off the front, sand it back, prime it, paint it, put the leather back on again. I've done it before. It's quite a fraught process, A lot of these components, as you can tell by what's painted and what wasn't, parts were painted and then they were riveted together after the event. Same with this catch here. That's the spring that holds our leg up at this point. In order to sort that out, if somebody's overstressed this, what you do to break it, you just pull it out like that, then you give it an extra twist. That'll damage the spring and it'll never snap back again. But it's something that you see with monotonous regularity. Right, so the door, we want the door on the camera. So a little bit of grease in the slots, top and bottom. And this door has a spring on it, which helps it open, spring open a bit. I'll stretch that into position. Here's the spring. We've got to get that tucked down in the body without damaging anything. And there's a technique for doing that. If I can find my rule, and I can't, we'll use this. Basically, we need to fold that spring down, and it's going to try and go through your finger, so because it's quite a strong spring. Fold that spring down, tuck it under, and then get this into the body behind it, like that. That's in position. Probably saw none of that. That's alright, the job's done. You have to wait for the next time I do it. 2 screws, one at the top, one at the bottom for our hinge pins. The bottom one, you're always going to have to push the door back against that spring, because the spring is closer to the bottom of the door. It has most of its leverage at that point. Let's get this screw in. Okay, so we've got our screws in top and bottom of the front door. There we go. None of the retinas were self-erecting. The best they did was pop open a little bit. The later ones didn't pop open as much as this. The rewind. I think that could go in next. That is not the piece I want. Where is the piece I want? Here it is. And 2 screws. And I'll check to see how many others I've got of that length, and check that I've got the right ones. Okay, it's interesting. Those are the screws I want, 2 of those. I should have 5 of them. And I'm not seeing 5. Now, what have we got here? No, that one there. Okay. That one there. That explains that. They'd been put somewhere else. So our rewind. Take some synthetic grease. Run it into the bush here. Push the shaft up through the bush. You might need to hold back the tab on the shaft here so that you can push it through easily. Oh, that's good. Feels nice and smooth running. Nothing like what it was before. Here are our 2 screws. These are nickel plated. They're just flat heads on them. You'd have almost expected them to be the raised heads in this position at the top of the camera. Rewind knob goes on. I'll put something through the fork of the rewind to stop it turning and just roll that on. That's the rewind dealt with. I could just about cover up the base of the camera, we won't bother with that just yet. Let's carry on with the film advance components. So the take-up spool, which is here, needs some lubrication on here. So on the spring and on that post, the central post there is where it revolves around. The spring just provides some tension so that it doesn't flop about. And the take-up shaft runs through this bush, and so I'll lubricate the bush with a bit of synthetic grease. You could use graphite grease for this, but if everything's in good order there's no special need to do that. Check that that moves smoothly, and it does. We have 3 screws that hold that in position, and we had them right in front of us just a minute ago. I'll put them somewhere else.